Marcus Williams had always been proud of his uniform. The crisp red fabric, the polished buttons, and the tall black hat that made him stand nearly 7 feet tall drew tourists from around the world. For 8 years, he had served as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, standing perfectly still for hours while visitors snapped photos and children tried to make him smile. His colleagues respected him, his supervisors praised his discipline, and his family back in Yorkshire bragged about their son who protected the Queen. But beneath that famous red coat, Marcus carried a secret that gnawed at him every single day. Despite his imposing appearance and military training, he felt weak. Not physically weak. His daily routine of marching, standing at attention, and carrying ceremonial weapons had kept him in decent shape. The weakness he felt was different, deeper. It was the kind that came from knowing that if a real threat emerged, if someone actually tried to harm the people he was sworn to protect, he might not be ready. The feeling had started 3 years ago during a security briefing. His commanding officer had mentioned how modern threats required more than just traditional military skills. Terrorists didn't follow rules of engagement. Criminals didn't wait for backup to arrive. In those crucial seconds when everything could go wrong, a guard needed to be able to handle himself with nothing but his bare hands. Marcus had nodded along with everyone else, but inside, his stomach had twisted with doubt. He had learned basics, hand-to-hand combat during his military training, of course. Every soldier did. But that was years ago, and it had been more about following instructions than actually fighting. He could throw a decent punch and knew how to wrestle someone to the ground, but what if that wasn't enough? What if he froze, up when it mattered most? What if his ceremonial training had made him soft? These thoughts haunted Marcus during those long hours of standing guard. While tourists assumed he was thinking about nothing at all, his mind raced with scenarios. What if someone rushed the gates? What if they got past the first line of security? What if it came down to him, alone, protecting innocent people? The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than his rifle. His wife Sarah had noticed the change in him. During their Sunday dinners, she would catch him staring into space, his jaw tight with worry. When she asked what was wrong, he would brush it off, claiming he was just tired from work. But Sarah knew her husband better than that. She had seen him tired before. This was something else entirely. This was fear, and it was eating away at the confident man she had married. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday morning in November. Marcus was standing his usual post when a group of teenage boys approached, phones in hand, ready to record another video of themselves trying to distract a royal guard. Most guards were used to this routine and barely registered it anymore. But as Marcus watched them approach, his heart began to race. Not because he was annoyed or amused, but because he realized that if these kids decided to rush him all at once, he honestly didn't know if he could handle them. They were just teenagers with phones, not terrorists with weapons. They posed no real threat to anyone. But the fact that even this harmless scenario made him nervous revealed just how far his confidence had fallen. Standing there in his perfect uniform, representing centuries of British military tradition, Marcus felt like a fraud. He looked strong, disciplined, and capable to everyone watching. Inside, he felt like he was barely keeping it together. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue living with this gnawing doubt about his abilities. He couldn't stand guard over people while wondering if he was truly capable of protecting them. He needed to do something about it, something that would either prove his fears were justified or help him overcome them once and for all. He started researching martial arts schools in London, looking for something that would teach him real fighting skills, not just the ceremonial combat he had learned in the military. He read reviews, watched videos, and tried to understand the differences between various fighting styles. Boxing seemed too limited, focusing only on punches. Karate appeared too formal, with patterns and techniques that might not work in real situations. Then he discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The videos fascinated him. Smaller people were defeating larger opponents using technique, timing, and leverage instead of brute force. This wasn't about throwing wild punches or trying to overpower someone with pure strength. This was chess played with the human body, a science of control and submission that could neutralize threats without causing unnecessary harm. It seemed perfect for someone in his position, someone who needed to be able to control dangerous situations without escalating them beyond what was necessary. Marcus found a gym called London Fight Academy just 20 minutes from his flat. The website showed people of all sizes and backgrounds training together, learning from instructors who had competed internationally. The schedule worked with his rotating shifts at the palace. Everything seemed to align perfectly, as if the universe was telling him this was exactly what he needed to do. But as he sat in his car outside the gym on that first evening, Marcus felt his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. What if he was terrible at this? What if years of ceremonial duty had made him too rigid, too slow, too set in his ways to learn something completely new? What if walking through those doors only confirmed his worst fears about himself? Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped out of his car and walked toward the entrance. He had spent years standing perfectly still while facing uncertainty. Now it was time to move forward and face it head-on. The smell hit Marcus first as he pushed open the heavy glass doors of London Fight Academy. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was completely foreign to someone accustomed to the sterile corridors of Buckingham Palace. Sweat, rubber mats, and something else he couldn't quite identify filled the air. The sound followed immediately after, grunts of exertion, the slap of bodies hitting mats, and the occasional sharp command from an instructor. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene before him. The main training area was larger than he had expected, with bright blue mats covering most of the floor. Along one wall, heavy bags hung at various heights, while another wall was lined with mirrors that reflected the organized chaos of training. People were scattered across the space in pairs, some standing and grappling, others rolling around on the ground in positions that looked impossible to understand from his perspective. What struck him most was the diversity of the people training. There were men and women, young and old, big and small. Some looked like professional athletes with muscles that belonged in fitness magazines. Others looked like they worked office jobs and had never seen the inside of a gym before this. A few appeared to be teenagers, while others had gray hair and moved with the careful precision of people who understood their limitations. A young woman with short blonde hair and calloused hands approached him with a friendly smile. She wore a white uniform that Marcus would later learn was called a GI, with a blue belt tied around her waist. Her name tag read, Emma, Instructor, and she moved with the kind of casual confidence that came from years of training. First time. Here? She asked, extending her hand. Marcus shook it and was surprised by the firmness of her grip. I'm Emma. Are you thinking about trying a class, or did you just want to look around first? Marcus had rehearsed this conversation in his car, but now that he was actually having it, the words felt awkward in his mouth. I'd like to try a class, he said. I've never done any martial arts before, but I think it might be good for me. Emma nodded knowingly, as if she had heard similar statements countless times before. What kind of work do you do? She asked. It helps me understand what someone might be looking for when they start training. For a split second, Marcus considered lying. He could say he worked security, which was technically true, or that he was in the military, which was his background. But something about Emma's straightforward manner made him want to be honest. I'm a royal guard, he said quietly, at Buckingham Palace. Emma's eyebrows shot up with genuine surprise and interest. Really, that's incredible. I bet you have amazing discipline and posture from that job. She glanced at the way he stood, perfectly straight, hands clasped behind his back without thinking about it. Have you done any combat training? Some, during my military service. But that was years ago and it wasn't very extensive. Mostly, basic stuff. Marcus felt heat creeping up his neck as he admitted this. Here he was, someone whose job was theoretically about protection and security, confessing that he felt completely unprepared for any real confrontation. Emma seemed to sense his discomfort and smoothly changed the subject. Well, Jiu-Jitsu is perfect for people who want practical self-defense skills. It's all about using technique instead of strength, which makes it work for anyone regardless of size or athletic ability. Would you like to watch a beginner class first or jump right in? Marcus looked out at the mats where people continued their training. Part of him wanted to observe for a while, to understand what he was getting himself into before committing. But he had already spent months thinking about this decision. More observation would just be another form of delay. "I'd like to jump right in," he said. Emma grinned and handed him a temporary uniform from a stack by the front desk. "Great attitude. Tonight's beginner class starts in 15 minutes. Get changed in the locker room over there and I'll introduce you to everyone when you come back out." The locker room was small but clean, with wooden benches and metal lockers that reminded Marcus of his early army days. As he changed into the borrowed GI, he caught sight of himself in a small mirror mounted on the wall. Without his red coat and tall hat, wearing this loose-fitting white uniform, he looked completely different. Smaller somehow. More vulnerable. For 8 years, his uniform had been like armor, projecting authority and strength to everyone who saw him. This new uniform stripped all of that away, leaving him feeling exposed and uncertain. When he emerged from the locker room, the beginner class was gathering in one corner of the mat. There were about 12 people in the group, and Marcus was relieved to see that several of them looked as nervous and out of place as he felt. A tall, thin man, who looked to be in his 40s, kept adjusting his guy and checking his belt as if it might fall off at any moment. A woman with red hair was stretching in a way that suggested she was trying to calm her nerves rather than prepare her muscles. Emma called the group together and began with introductions. When it came to Marcus's turn, he simply said his name and mentioned that this was his first time doing any martial arts. He didn't mention his job, and Emma respected his privacy by not bringing it up either. The other beginners shared similar stories: office workers looking for fitness, parents wanting to learn self-defense, students trying something new. The warm-up was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his military training. Instead of running laps or doing push-ups, they started with movement exercises that seemed designed to make his body bend and twist in ways it wasn't accustomed to. They practiced forward rolls, backward rolls, and something called shrimping that involved lying on their sides and scooting across the mat using their hips and legs. At first, Marcus felt clumsy and awkward. His body, so used to standing perfectly still for hours, seemed to rebel against these new movements. He rolled crookedly, his shrimping looked more like flopping, and he found himself getting dizzy from the unfamiliar positions. But as the warm-up continued, something interesting began to happen. The movements started to feel less foreign, and he began to understand the purpose behind each exercise. Emma then demonstrated the first technique they would learn, a basic position called the guard. She had another instructor lie on his back, while she knelt between his legs, showing how the person on the bottom could use their legs to control the person on top. It looked simple enough, but when Marcus paired up with the nervous-looking businessman for practice, he quickly discovered that even the most basic positions in Jiu-Jitsu were far more complex than they appeared. His partner, whose name was David, and who worked in accounting, seemed just as confused as Marcus felt. They took turns being on top and bottom, trying to recreate what Emma had shown them. Neither of them could quite get their legs in the right position, and their grips felt awkward and uncertain. But David was patient and good-natured about their mutual incompetence, even laughing when they got tangled up and had to start over. As the class progressed, Marcus found himself becoming completely absorbed in the technical challenges. This wasn't about being strong or tough. It was about understanding leverage, timing, and body mechanics. When Emma showed them how to escape from the guard position, it involved a specific sequence of hand placement, hip movement, and weight distribution that required total concentration to execute correctly. By the end of the 90-minute class, Marcus was exhausted in a way he hadn't experienced since his early army training. His GI was soaked with sweat, his muscles ached from holding unfamiliar positions, and his brain felt overloaded with new information. But underneath the fatigue, he felt something else that surprised him completely. He felt excited. For the first time in months, that nagging voice of self-doubt in his head had gone completely quiet. 3 months passed in what felt like a blur of learning and transformation. Marcus found himself counting down the hours during his shifts at Buckingham Palace, not because he was bored with his duties, but because he was eager to get to the gym and continue his jiu-jitsu education. The rigid discipline that had made him an excellent royal guard now served him well as a martial arts student. He arrived early to every class, stayed late to practice techniques, and approached each lesson with the same methodical attention to detail that he brought to his ceremonial duties. The changes in Marcus were subtle at first, but they were undeniably real. His posture, already excellent from years of military training, somehow became even better as he learned to move his body with purpose and control. His confidence, which had been steadily eroding under the weight of his self-doubt, began to rebuild itself on a foundation of actual skills rather than just appearances. Most importantly, the nagging fear that had haunted him for years was gradually being replaced by a quiet sense of competence. Sarah noticed the transformation before anyone else. Her husband came home from training sessions tired but energized, and he had started talking about leverage points and joint manipulation, with the same enthusiasm he once reserved for military history. She had initially worried that this new hobby might be dangerous, but seeing how much happier and more confident Marcus had become, she found herself encouraging his passion. At the gym, Marcus had earned a reputation as one of the most dedicated beginners anyone had seen. Emma frequently used him as an example of how proper practice and patience could lead to rapid improvement. His military background had given him advantages that weren't immediately obvious. He could follow instructions precisely, he had excellent body awareness, and he never got frustrated when techniques didn't work the first time he tried them. But Marcus also discovered that his biggest advantages could sometimes become limitations. His instinct was to use strength and muscle memory from his military training, when Jiu-Jitsu often required the opposite approach. Emma spent considerable time helping him understand that force usually worked against technique, not with it. Learning to relax and flow with movements instead of powering through them became one of his biggest challenges and most significant breakthroughs. The gym culture fascinated Marcus almost as much as the techniques themselves. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of palace life, the Jiu-Jitsu community operated on a system of mutual respect and shared learning that transcended traditional social boundaries. The young woman who taught children's classes during the day might tap out a construction worker twice her size during evening training. The soft-spoken accountant who seemed timid in everyday conversation might demonstrate a submission technique that could incapacitate someone in seconds. Marcus particularly enjoyed training with David, his partner from that first nervous class. Both men had progressed at similar rates, and they had developed a friendship based on their shared journey from complete beginners to reasonably competent white belts. They pushed each other to improve, while maintaining the kind of supportive rivalry that made training more enjoyable for both of them. As Marcus became more comfortable with the basics, Emma began introducing him to the competition team training sessions. These were held twice a week and featured the gym's most serious students, including several who competed regularly in local tournaments. The pace was faster, the techniques more advanced, and the training partners more experienced. Marcus felt intimidated at first, but Emma assured him that training with better opponents was the fastest way to improve. It was during one of these advanced sessions that Marcus first encountered Jake Martinez, a brown belt who had been training for nearly 10 years. Jake was exactly the kind of person who had intimidated Marcus during his first visits to the gym. He was shorter than Marcus, but built like a professional athlete, with broad shoulders, thick arms, and hands that looked like they could crush rocks. His GI was faded and patched from years of training, and he moved across the mats with the fluid confidence of someone who had mastered the fundamentals so completely that they had become instinctive. More importantly, from Marcus's perspective, Jake had recently been promoted to brown belt, just one level below the coveted black belt. In the jiu-jitsu world, brown belts were considered experts who had dedicated years to perfecting their craft. They were the people who taught seminars, competed at national levels, and served as assistant instructors for lower-ranked students. To a 3-month white belt like Marcus, Jake represented everything he hoped to eventually become. The first time they trained together, Jake was patient and encouraging, working at a pace that allowed Marcus to attempt techniques without being completely overwhelmed. He offered helpful corrections and praise when Marcus did something correctly. It was exactly the kind of training experience that Emma had promised, challenging but educational, pushing Marcus to improve while keeping him safe from injury. But something changed during their third training session together. Marcus had been working on a sweep that Emma had taught him the previous week, and he had managed to execute it successfully against Jake twice in a row. The technique involved using his legs to unbalance Jake and reverse their positions, going from being controlled on the bottom to being in control on top. For Marcus, successfully completing the move against such an experienced training partner felt like a significant accomplishment. Jake's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His friendly demeanor became slightly cooler, his instruction less forthcoming. When other students asked him to demonstrate techniques, he remained his usual helpful self. But with Marcus, a certain competitive edge began to creep into their training sessions. Jake started working harder, using more advanced techniques and generally making it clear that he wasn't going to make things easy for the newcomer anymore. Marcus initially assumed this was just Jake's way of challenging him to improve. In his military experience, instructors often became more demanding as students progressed, pushing them to reach higher levels of performance. He welcomed the increased intensity and tried to rise to meet it. But other students began to notice the shift in dynamics between them. During a break between training rounds, David pulled Marcus aside and mentioned that Jake seemed to be taking their roles more seriously than usual. "He's really going after you," David observed. "I mean, that's not necessarily bad, but he definitely seems more intense with you than with other white belts." Emma noticed it too and made a point of watching their training sessions more closely. What she saw concerned her slightly. Jake was technically following all the rules and training safely, but he was clearly pushing Marcus harder than was typical for someone with only 3 months of experience. His submission attempts were more aggressive, his pace was faster, and his overall approach suggested he was treating Marcus more like a competitive opponent than a learning partner. When Emma asked Jake about it privately after class, his response was defensive. "The guy's got natural ability," Jake said. "If I go easy on him, he's not going to learn as much. Besides, he's a soldier, right? He can handle a little intensity." Emma wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation, but Jake was one of her most experienced students and had never caused problems before. She decided to monitor the situation rather than intervene directly. However, she did make a mental note to pair Marcus with other training partners more often, just to ensure he continued to have positive learning experiences. Marcus, meanwhile, remained focused on his own improvement and largely oblivious to the undercurrents of his training relationship with Jake. He was learning faster than he had ever imagined possible. His confidence was growing daily, and he felt more capable of protecting others than he had in years. The specific dynamics with one training partner seemed far less important than the overall transformation he was experiencing. But those dynamics were about to become much more significant than anyone could have predicted. The evening started like any other advanced training session, with students pairing off for warm-up roles while Emma organized the night's lesson plan. Marcus arrived a few minutes early, as had become his habit, and began stretching in his usual spot near the corner of the mat. He had learned to use these quiet moments before class to mentally prepare himself, reviewing techniques he wanted to work on and setting goals for the training session ahead. Jake arrived shortly after, his gym bag slung over his shoulder and his brown belt tied with the casual precision of someone who had performed the same ritual thousands of times. He nodded to Marcus in acknowledgement, but didn't approach for their usual pre-class conversation. Instead, he began his own warm-up routine on the opposite side of the mat, stretching with the focused intensity of someone preparing for competition rather than friendly practice. Emma called the class together and announced that tonight's session would focus on submission escapes, techniques for getting out of dangerous positions when an opponent was trying to finish the match. For Marcus, this was exactly the kind of practical knowledge he had been hoping to learn when he first walked into the gym. These weren't flashy moves designed to impress spectators. They were survival skills that could mean the difference between tapping out and continuing to fight. The first technique Emma demonstrated was an escape from a rear naked choke, one of the most common and dangerous submissions in Jiu-Jitsu. She showed how to protect the neck, create space, and eventually turn to face the opponent and escape the position entirely. The movements required precise timing and coordination, but the underlying principle was straightforward. Stay calm, Follow the steps and trust the technique to work. When Emma called for partners to practice the escape, Jake approached Marcus with what seemed like his usual training demeanor. "Want to work on this together?" he asked, and Marcus nodded agreement. They had drilled similar techniques before, and despite the recent increase in intensity during their rolling sessions, their technical practice had remained productive and friendly. They took turns applying the choke and practicing the escape, with Jake offering corrections and encouragement as Marcus worked through the sequence. Everything seemed normal until other students began gathering around their corner of the mat to watch. At first, Marcus assumed they were simply observing Emma's demonstration from a different angle, but he gradually became aware that their attention was focused specifically on him and Jake. The reason became clear when he overheard two blue belts talking quietly nearby. "Check it out," one of them said to his training partner. "The new guy actually looks pretty good. Jake's gonna have to work for it if they roll tonight." The second blue belt glanced over at Marcus and Jake, then shook, his head with amusement. "Jake's not going to like that. You know how he gets when someone starts catching up to his level too quickly." Marcus felt a flush of both pride and anxiety at these comments. On one hand, it was gratifying to know that his progress was visible to experienced students. On the other hand, he was beginning to understand that his improvement might be creating tensions he hadn't anticipated. The Jiu-Jitsu community had welcomed him warmly, but like any group of dedicated practitioners, it had its own internal dynamics and unspoken hierarchies. As if sensing the growing attention, Jake seemed to become more focused and serious during their technical practice. His applications of the rear naked choke became tighter and more precise, making the escape more difficult for Marcus to execute. When it was Marcus's turn to apply the choke, Jake's escapes became demonstrations of superior technique, executed with the kind of fluid efficiency that reminded everyone watching of the skill gap between a brown belt and a white belt. Emma noticed the gathering crowd and the shift in energy around Marcus and Jake's training. During a brief break in the technical instruction, she approached their corner of the mat with a concerned expression. "Everything okay over here?" she asked, looking directly at Jake. "You guys seem to be drawing quite an audience tonight." Jake straightened up and adjusted his GI with exaggerated casualness. "Just working on the techniques," he replied. "Marcus is picking things up pretty quickly, so I'm making sure he gets a good challenge." There was nothing technically wrong with his words, but something in his tone suggested that the challenge he was referring to went beyond simple technical instruction. Marcus, still largely unaware of the undercurrents of the situation, smiled and nodded in agreement. "Jake's been really helpful," he said to Emma. "I feel like I'm learning a lot from training with someone at his level." This innocent comment seemed to have an unexpected effect on Jake, whose jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Emma studied both men for a moment, then made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire evening. "You know what?" she said, loud enough for the nearby students to hear. "Why don't you two demonstrate the escape sequence for everyone? It might be helpful for the other students to see it executed by training partners with different experience levels." What Emma intended as a routine demonstration request was interpreted very differently by Jake and by the students who had been watching their interaction. To Jake, it felt like Emma was putting his superior skills on display, expecting him to easily handle a white belt in front of an audience. To the watching students, it looked like Emma was setting up a test. Would the experienced brown belt be able to dominate the promising newcomer, or had Marcus progressed enough to make things interesting? Marcus remained oblivious to these interpretations and simply prepared to demonstrate the technique as requested. He had performed demonstrations before during his military service and felt comfortable being watched while executing drills. In his mind, this was just another learning opportunity, a chance to practice techniques in front of experienced students who might offer helpful feedback. The demonstration began normally, with Marcus applying the rear naked choke while Jake performed the escape sequence that Emma had taught them. Jake's technique was flawless, a textbook example of how to systematically dismantle an opponent's submission attempt. The watching students nodded appreciatively, and Emma offered positive feedback on both men's execution of the technique. Then, it was Jake's turn to apply the choke while Marcus demonstrated the escape. This should have been equally routine, Jake would apply the submission with control and precision, allowing Marcus to work through the defensive sequence without excessive pressure or resistance. But as Jake settled into position behind Marcus and began to apply the choke, it became clear that his intentions were different from what anyone had expected. Instead of the controlled application they had been practicing, Jake's choke was tight, aggressive, and applied with the kind of finishing pressure used in actual competition. Marcus immediately felt the difference but assumed that Jake was simply making the demonstration more realistic to challenge his defensive skills. He began working through the escape sequence, but Jake's grip was significantly stronger and more technically precise than anything Marcus had experienced during their practice rounds. The watching students recognized what was happening immediately. This wasn't a demonstration anymore. It was Jake testing Marcus under pressure, seeing if the white belt could handle a brown belt's serious submission attempt. Emma started to step forward, concerned about the sudden escalation, but hesitated when she saw that Marcus was actually working through the escape sequence despite the increased pressure. What happened next surprised everyone in the gym, including Marcus himself. Despite Jake's superior technique and experience, despite the significant skill gap between white belt and brown belt, Marcus managed to create the space he needed and began to turn into Jake's guard, just as Emma had taught them. His movement wasn't perfect, but it was effective enough to escape the immediate danger of the choke. Jake's reaction was swift and unmistakable. Instead of releasing the position as would be normal in a demonstration, he attempted to transition to a different submission, trying to catch Marcus's arm as he turned. But Marcus, operating on instinct and adrenaline, managed to pull his arm free and complete his escape, ending up in Jake's guard in a position where neither man had a clear advantage. The entire sequence had taken less than 30 seconds, but it had transformed what was supposed to be a simple technical demonstration into something much more significant. Marcus had not only escaped a serious submission attempt from a brown belt, but he had done so in front of an audience of experienced students who understood exactly how difficult such an escape should have been for someone with only 3 months of training. The mat fell completely silent as both men sat facing each other, breathing hard and staring with an intensity that had nothing to do with friendly practice. Emma stepped forward, ready to defuse the situation, but before she could speak, Jake pushed himself to his feet and looked down at Marcus with an expression that mixed surprise, irritation, and something that looked very much like wounded pride. "Not bad," Jake said, his voice carefully controlled. "Want to see how you do when we're actually rolling instead of just drilling techniques?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore and dangerous to breathe in too deeply. Marcus looked up at Jake from his seated position on the mat, acutely aware that every student in the gym had stopped their own training to watch this moment unfold. Emma opened her mouth to redirect the energy back toward technical instruction, but Marcus stood up and faced Jake directly before she could intervene. "Sure," Marcus said quietly, his military training helping him keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I'd like that." Emma stepped between them, her expression serious and authoritative. "Guys, I think we should stick with the technical work tonight. We've got a lot of material to cover, and I want everyone to focus on learning rather than competing." Her words were sensible and professional, exactly what an experienced instructor should say when training intensity was escalating beyond appropriate levels. But Jake shook his head with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, Emma. It's just a friendly roll. Besides, Marcus needs to experience what it's like to train with someone who isn't holding back. That's how he'll really improve." His tone was reasonable and measured, but everyone present could feel the competitive tension radiating from his posture. The other students had formed a loose circle around the three of them, creating an informal arena that made backing down feel impossible for both men. Marcus could see David among the watching faces, his expression worried and uncertain. Other students looked excited, as if they were about to witness something special. A few of the more experienced blue and purple belts exchanged knowing glances. That suggested they had seen this kind of situation develop before. Emma hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. As an instructor, she had the authority to shut down the situation immediately. But Jake was one of her most experienced students and had never caused serious problems before. Marcus was an adult who had been training for months and presumably understood the risks involved in rolling with more experienced partners. Most importantly, both men seemed calm and controlled rather than angry or reckless. "Fine," she said finally. "But we're doing this properly. 5-minute round, standard rules, and I'm watching every second. If I see anything unsafe or inappropriate, we stop immediately. Understood?" Both men nodded their agreement and moved to the center of the mat. The watching students repositioned themselves to get better views, their casual conversations replaced by an electric silence that seemed to charge the air around them. Emma positioned herself at the edge of the circle where she could see everything clearly and glanced at the clock on the wall. Marcus and Jake knelt facing each other in the traditional starting position, their hands gripping each other's GI collars and sleeves. For a moment, they remained perfectly still, each man studying his opponent and preparing for what was about to happen. Marcus could feel his heart beating faster than usual, but his breathing remained calm and controlled. Years of standing at attention during unpredictable situations had taught him how to manage nervous energy. Jake's preparation was different, more focused and predatory. His grip adjustments were subtle but precise, positioning his hands for maximum leverage and control. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, the pattern of someone who had done this countless times before. When he looked at Marcus, his eyes held the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was no longer seeing a training partner or fellow student, but rather an opponent to be defeated. Emma called for them to begin, and the match started exactly as everyone expected it would. Jake immediately began working for a dominant position, using his superior technical knowledge to advance methodically toward a submission. His movements were smooth and efficient, demonstrating the kind of flowing technique that only came from years of dedicated practice. Marcus found himself on the defensive immediately, working to prevent Jake from securing the dominant positions that would lead to quick submissions. His defensive instincts, developed through months of training with various partners, served him well during the initial exchanges. He managed to avoid Jake's first few submission attempts and even created enough space to attempt a sweep of his own, though Jake defended it easily. For the first 2 minutes of the match, everything proceeded according to the unspoken script that everyone present understood. The brown belt was clearly superior, controlling the pace and position while the white belt worked hard just to survive. Jake's technique was beautiful to watch, a demonstration of leverage, timing, and control that reminded everyone why belt rankings existed in the first place. But something unexpected began to happen as the match progressed into its 3rd minute. Marcus, instead of becoming more tired and defensive under Jake's pressure, seemed to be settling into a rhythm. His movements became more fluid and confident, his defensive reactions faster and more instinctive. Most surprisingly, he began to create offensive opportunities of his own, threatening Jake with submission attempts and positional advances that forced the brown belt to work harder than anyone had anticipated. The shift was subtle at first, but the experienced students watching began to notice it immediately. Marcus was no longer simply defending against Jake's attacks. He was starting to dictate portions of the exchange himself. When Jake attempted a collar choke, Marcus not only defended it, but transitioned smoothly into an armbar attempt that forced Jake to abandon his original attack. When Jake tried to pass Marcus's guard, Marcus used his legs and hips to sweep Jake and momentarily take the top position. Jake's reaction to these developments was visible to everyone watching. His technique remained excellent, but his movements became more urgent and less controlled. He began using more strength and aggression, abandoning some of the flowing technical beauty that had characterized his initial approach. Most tellingly, his breathing became heavier and less rhythmic, suggesting that Marcus was forcing him to work much harder than he had expected. Emma watched this evolution with growing concern and fascination. As an instructor, she could see that both men were still training safely and within reasonable boundaries, but she could also see that what had started as a routine rolling session was transforming into something much more significant. Jake's pride was clearly on the line, while Marcus seemed to be discovering capabilities he didn't know he possessed. The 4th minute of the match brought the most dramatic developments yet. Marcus managed to secure a dominant position on top of Jake and began working for a submission of his own. His technique wasn't perfect, His positioning showed the limitations of his experience, but his pressure and control were surprisingly effective. Jake found himself in the unfamiliar position of having to escape from underneath a white belt, something that should have been routine for someone of his skill level, but was proving more difficult than anticipated. As Jake worked to escape, Marcus maintained his position with a combination of technique and determination that impressed everyone watching. His base was solid, his weight distribution effective, and his grip fighting showed real understanding of leverage principles. When Jake attempted to bridge and roll, Marcus adjusted smoothly to maintain control. When Jake tried to create space with his arms, Marcus pressed forward and eliminated the gaps immediately. The watching students began to murmur among themselves, quiet conversations about what they were witnessing. David caught Emma's eye and raised his eyebrows in amazement. Some of the blue belts exchanged glances that mixed admiration for Marcus's performance with concern about how Jake was handling the situation. Everyone present understood they were watching something unusual, a white belt with 3 months of experience holding his own against a brown belt with nearly a decade of training. Jake's frustration was becoming more apparent with each passing. Second, his escapes were technically sound but lacked the calm precision that had characterized his earlier performance. He was working harder, breathing heavier, and showing the kind of visible effort that experienced grapplers rarely displayed. When rolling with much less experienced partners, most concerning to Emma, his grip fighting was becoming more aggressive, using strength rather than technique to create the openings he needed. With less than a minute remaining in the 5-minute round, Jake managed to escape Marcus's control and reverse their positions. But instead of the dominant control he had established earlier in the match, Jake found himself in Marcus's guard, a position where the person on bottom has numerous defensive and offensive options. Marcus immediately began working his guard game, using his legs to control Jake's posture and create submission threats. The final 30 seconds of the match became a frantic exchange as Jake pressed for a decisive submission, while Marcus defended and countered with increasing confidence. Jake's technical superiority was still evident, but Marcus's conditioning, determination, and surprisingly solid defensive instincts were neutralizing many of Jake's advantages. The brown belt was working much harder than he had expected, while the white belt seemed to be gaining energy and confidence as the match progressed. When Emma finally called time, both men were breathing heavily and covered in sweat. They remained in their final positions for a moment, as if neither quite believed the round was over. Jake had not achieved the dominant performance that the week that followed felt different for everyone involved. Marcus returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace with a quiet confidence that his colleagues noticed immediately. His posture, already excellent, now carried an additional quality of relaxed alertness. When tourists approached for photos, when security briefings discussed potential threats, when his commanding officers outlined new protocols, Marcus listened with the calm attention of someone who truly believed he could handle whatever challenges might arise. At the gym, word of the unexpected match spread quickly through the community. Students who hadn't been present that night heard various versions of the story, each retelling adding its own emphasis and interpretation. Some focused on Marcus's surprising competitiveness against a much more experienced opponent. Others highlighted Jake's visible frustration and the unusual amount of effort he had been forced to expend. Everyone agreed that something significant had happened, even if they weren't entirely sure what it meant. Jake spent the week training with increased intensity and focus. He arrived earlier, stayed later, and approached every rolling session with the kind of serious preparation usually reserved for competition. His training partners noticed the change but understood its source. Pride was a powerful motivator in martial arts, and having that pride challenged could either destroy a student's confidence or push them to reach new levels of performance. Emma watched these developments with the experienced eye of someone who had seen similar situations unfold before. Competition and ego were natural parts of any martial arts community, but they needed to be managed carefully to prevent them from disrupting the positive learning environment she had worked years to create. She made a point of training with both men during the week, offering technical advice and encouragement while trying to gauge their mental states. When she rolled with Marcus, Emma was impressed by his continued improvement and his ability to integrate the lessons from his match with Jake. His guard work was more confident, his submission attempts more technically sound, and his overall game plan more sophisticated. But most importantly, he remained humble and eager to learn, treating their training sessions as educational opportunities rather than tests of his abilities. Her sessions with Jake were more concerning. His technique remained excellent, but there was an edge to his training that hadn't been there before. He was working harder against all of his partners, not just Marcus, and his usual willingness to help newer students with technical advice had been replaced by a more competitive and less generous approach to training. As the following Tuesday approached, anticipation built throughout the gym. Students who normally trained on different nights made arrangements to attend the advanced session. Emma considered separating Marcus and Jake for the evening, pairing them with different training partners to let tensions cool down. But both men had specifically requested to train together again, and she ultimately decided that avoiding the situation would only postpone the inevitable resolution. The evening began normally, with technical instruction on takedown defense. Marcus and Jake worked together on the drills with professional courtesy, offering corrections and encouragement as they practiced the techniques. To casual observers, their interaction seemed perfectly normal. But Emma and the other experienced students could sense the underlying tension, the careful politeness that suggested both men were thinking about more than just the immediate lesson. When free rolling time arrived, Jake approached Marcus without ceremony. "Ready for round 2? He asked, his tone casual but his eyes intense. Marcus nodded and they moved to an open section of the mat, drawing immediate attention from everyone else in the gym. This time there was no pretense about friendly practice or technical demonstration. Both men understood that reputations were on the line, that the previous week's ambiguous outcome needed clarification. The watching students formed their circle more quickly, their conversations dying away as they prepared to witness what promised to be a more definitive confrontation. Emma positioned herself where she could intervene if necessary, but she could see that both men were focused and controlled rather than angry or reckless. Jake had clearly spent the week preparing for this moment, and Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already proven he belonged at this level. They started from their knees in the traditional position, hands gripping each other's GI collars and sleeves. For several seconds they remained motionless, each man studying his opponent and preparing his strategy. The silence in the gym was complete, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of the ventilation system. When Emma signaled for them to begin, Jake's approach was immediately different from the previous week. Instead of working methodically for dominant positions, he attacked aggressively from the opening seconds, attempting a foot sweep that would have put Marcus on his back immediately. Marcus defended the takedown attempt and countered with a grip break that forced Jake to reset his approach. The pace of the match was faster and more intense than their previous encounter, with both men pushing the tempo from the beginning. Jake's technical advantages were still evident, but Marcus's improved timing and conditioning allowed him to keep pace with the brown belt's aggressive style. They exchanged position and submission attempts with a fluidity that suggested both men had internalized the lessons from their previous match. 2 minutes into the 5-minute round, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of not just the match but Marcus's entire understanding of his own capabilities. Jake had secured a dominant position and was working for a collar choke, applying pressure gradually as he adjusted his grip for maximum effectiveness. Marcus was defending properly, protecting his neck and working to create space for an escape. But, instead of the methodical defensive sequence he had been taught, Marcus found himself reacting with pure instinct. In a movement that surprised everyone present, including himself, he explosively bridged and twisted in a direction that should have been impossible to achieve from his position. The movement created exactly the space he needed, and in one fluid motion, he slipped out of Jake's control and reversed their positions completely. The technique wasn't something Marcus had learned in class or practiced during drilling sessions. It came from somewhere deeper, from the intersection of his natural athleticism, his months of training, and the kind of desperate creativity that emerged only under extreme pressure. The movement was so unexpected and technically sophisticated that even Jake was caught off guard. ending up in a vulnerable position that Marcus immediately began to exploit. What followed lasted exactly 13 seconds, though it felt both eternal and instantaneous to everyone watching. Marcus secured Jake's arm and began applying a textbook armbar, controlling the brown belt's movement and applying pressure to the elbow joint with methodical precision. Jake's attempts to escape only made the submission tighter, and Marcus's technique was executed with a clarity and confidence that seemed impossible for someone with less than 4 months of training. For several seconds, Jake tried to power out of the submission using strength and experience. But Marcus's position was too good, his technique too precise, and his determination too complete. The pressure on Jake's elbow increased beyond what he could safely endure, and with the gym watching in stunned silence, he tapped twice on Marcus's leg to signal his submission. The mat erupted in cheers and amazement as Marcus immediately released the submission and helped Jake to his feet. The brown belt's expression was a complex mixture of shock, respect, and wounded pride. He had just been submitted by a white belt with 3 months of experience, something that should have been virtually impossible under normal circumstances. But as Jake looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time, he began to understand that these weren't normal circumstances at all. This wasn't just any white belt who had gotten lucky with a single technique. This was someone with natural ability, dedication, and the kind of mental toughness that couldn't be taught in any class. This was someone who had found his calling. "Jesus," Jake said quietly, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Where the hell did that come from?" Marcus shook his hand, still processing what had just happened. "I honestly don't know," he replied. "It just felt right." Emma approached them both, her expression mixing pride in Marcus's achievement with concern for how Jake was handling the situation. But as she watched the two men's interaction, she realized that something important had shifted. The competitive tension that had driven their conflict was being replaced by mutual respect and recognition. "You know what?" Jake said, addressing both Marcus and Emma. "I think I've been approaching this all wrong. Marcus, you're not just a good white belt. You're someone who's going to be really dangerous when you get more experience. Want to train together regularly? Actually train, not compete?" As Marcus nodded his agreement, he felt the last traces of the self-doubt that had plagued him for years finally disappear completely. He had proven to himself and everyone present that he was capable of protecting others when it mattered most. The royal guard who had once questioned his own abilities now knew exactly what he could accomplish. "When Standy,"